Okay, guys, so we are continuing on with Unit 7, and we're talking about the other movements of the mid 20th century, aside from the two biggest, which were women's lib and the civil rights movement. So we've already gone into the gay liberation movement and the Chicano movement. So in this video, we're going to talk about the Red Power movement, which is Native Americans. So a little background. We know a lot, through AP US History and American 1 and 2, we know a lot about how the federal government and American people have treated Native Americans since the very beginning, since 1607 and before that. We know that there has been a long-standing tradition of promises and treaties broken over and over, seizures of land and property, forced assimilation, which turned into genocide and then paper genocide, and just an effort to sort of like wipe the mistakes of the American government away from the history books by not recording Native American history, which is what paper genocide is. And as time went on, more problems began to happen, but because people just stopped paying attention, it was hard for a lot of Native American tribes to exercise their voice. I mean, this was a people who 200 years ago, their numbers were in the millions, and now we're getting to a point where there's, just maybe under a million left in all of the United States in the 1960s and 70s. So it's definitely a very different state, and they're all, all over the place. They're not all obviously living in one area. They're, sporadic across the plains and the West and parts of the East. And in the coming out of World War II, we saw several things sort of starting to gear up again of, the United States falling back into that pattern of making promises, breaking them, and things being worse for the Native American people than they were before. Two major issues before the movement began in this post-war era that the movement is going to try to tackle. The first is uranium mining. So they found some uranium mines on Navajo land and a few other Native American reservations. And so the federal government basically was like, we're gonna mine this. You can't really stop us, but we'll take as good of care of you as possible. Obviously, this already is a problem, because how many times has the federal government taken land or damaged land that belonged to Native Americans? I mean, during World War II, Japanese internment camps a lot of them were built on Native American reservation land, because the United States figured that they wouldn't have to use their own. And so this is just one example, but as this uranium mining continued, what they realized was that a lot of the waste that was created from the mining was being dumped into the water supply, which was basically creating radiation poisoning that was leading to health and birth defects among these Navajo communities and other Native populations. And so trying to get attention drawn to this issue and the damage that the federal government, we're also getting ready to get into the environmental movement. So these two things are sort of going hand in hand. Aside from the uranium mining, the other major issue that we're going to see happen in this post-war period is the Relocation Act of 1956. So this was signed into law by President Eisenhower. And what this did was two things. One, it basically once again will end the legal tribal system. We did this back in the 1800s, and it did a lot of damage to a lot of different communities. And this was one of the first time we did this, was one of the first efforts we saw at forced assimilation in the United States. And it was definitely an embarrassing moment, a black spot in American history. And we basically do it all over again here. and the Relocation Act. And what this does is it says, we're no longer using tribes. Tribes are not governing themselves. Native Americans are classified as like wards of the United States, so like they can govern themselves and like do their own thing, but they're subject to federal law. They don't have to like listen to states or anything. They just like their land is their own land within a state. The state has no control over their like land or what's happening on their reservation. Only the federal government does. And here the federal government's basically saying we're absolving that. And now tribes will no longer be able to govern themselves. They will be subject. They're going to be just regular U.S. citizens. They're going to be subject to anything that the state or local communities decide. And in doing that, that gives states the opportunity to take land away from Native Americans or build things on their land. And then in addition to that, the whole purpose of this is to basically pressure a lot of these Native American communities to relocate to cities. We're coming out of, World War II. And before that, we were in the middle of the Great Depression in the New Deal, where we saw basically the beginning of the welfare state in the United States. So coming out of World War II, when we're in this period of like economic prosperity and boom, a lot of people were looking around saying like, well, how can we make sure that we stay this way? We need to make sure that we are fueling industrial growth, that we are fueling economic growth, that people are making their own money, and that we try to deplete that welfare state as much as possible. And so a lot of people blamed minorities and immigrants for the creation of that welfare state, because primarily the people on or using welfare systems are minorities. But that's not because of anything other than, generational and systematic economic inequality that has yet to be worked out correctly. But they basically were like, well, here, we'll fix it here. We're going to get everyone to move to cities, and then there they will get jobs and they will be more successful. So they promised all these things in the Relocation Act. They said that they were going to provide housing assistance and jobs and vocational training and better health care and like all these things. And they were going to allot all this money to Indian relocation in these cities. So over the next 30 years or so, close to 750,000 Native Americans, to survive, feel like they have to move to cities because their entire like tribal system of life back on their reservation has just been eliminated. But unfortunately, history repeats itself here, and the promises made in this Relocation Act are not kept. And all of the money that was supposed to be going into this was completely mismanaged. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, which was the group that was supposed to monitor all of this, threw out time after time after time, we see the BIA being a huge problem for Native Americans instead of a big solution or a helping hand. And they were not given all of the things that they said they were going to be given. And overwhelmingly, most of the Native Americans who will relocate to these cities because of this act are going to be worse off than they were before. They're going to sink further into economic depression, increasing the disparity there among racial groups. And that's a thing that we continue to see today. Even though we've repealed the Relocation Act and we've disbanded a lot of these organizations that actually hurt Native Americans, we still see the generational effects of this to this day. I mean, this wasn't that long ago, 1956. So there are plenty of Native American families today who are still feeling the negative financial consequences of what happened and how this began in 1956. So as a lot of these movements begin to, get media attention and create actual change, specifically the civil rights movement, which kicked all of it off, but then the second wave of feminism, this women's liberation movement, as it began, and other groups like we saw with the Chicanos and the gay lib movement, other groups see these disenfranchised populations seizing back power for themselves, and they feel inspired to do so for their community. So that's when we see the Red Power movement begin. We really consider the beginning of the Red Power movement to be the founding of an organization called the American Indian Movement. And I know that that's kind of confusing because most organizations don't have the word movement in the name, but the American Indian Movement yes, is part of a movement, but it is an organization. The overall movement, the entire movement, is called the Red Power movement, like the civil rights movement is to the NAACP as the Red Power movement is to the American Indian movement. So I know that's kind of confusing. Don't let the name trip you up, but we will call them AIM for short, AIM. AIM was founded in July of 1968 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and they wanted to create real economic independence for Native Americans. That was their largest goal. And a lot of their smaller objectives can be traced back to this, whether it be education reform or, job help or vocational training. All of that stuff goes back to trying to create a truly economic independent society for Native Americans where they can only have to rely on themselves. And it's completely understandable why they would only want to rely on themselves, considering how the interference of the U.S. government has just continuously crushed their populations over and over and over again. So they're going to be the first group to use that phrase, red power, and that's really going to start to kick this off. So they're going to inspire a lot of smaller organizations to be born out of them, like Indians of all tribes, or they even had an all-women's branch of AIM called WARN, which stood for Women of All Red Nations, and it was founded by two members of AIM in 1974. It was Lorelei Means and Madonna Thunderhawk. So Lorelei and Madonna noticed that there were issues that the overall movement wasn't, and the American Indian movement wasn't able to focus as much on, because they were focusing so much on getting those, that economic equality worked out. But there were other issues that were affecting specifically women and children, family rights, that the organization wasn't spending enough time on. And so these ladies decided, along with several other women, that they were going to use AIM's resources, but form their own branch of the organization solely devoted to women and family rights. And so that's what WARN was, Women of All Red Nations. Probably the biggest thing that they focused on during their existence was health issues. And this is something that we see very similar to the Chicana movement, when the Chicanas were focused on stopping forced sterilization of Mexican women. That is also something that was happening to Native American women. Forced sterilization was taking place in the exact same way. And so that's going to be a major goal of WARN, and something that they will be able to overcome, just as the Chicano movement was as well. There were quite a few major moments through this Red Power movement, a lot of large protests, and things that are going to lead to legal change, but definitely the most well-known and one of those early protests that got a lot of media attention was the occupation of Alcatraz. So Alcatraz is a prison, federal prison, that is in San Francisco. It is abandoned and has been abandoned since 1963. It's still there. It's an island. If you haven't seen the movie, Escape from Alcatraz, which is about when these four guys escaped. It's a true story. These four guys escaped from Alcatraz, but they were never found. So most people just assume that they just drowned in the ocean trying to swim from the island to California, to the mainland. But some people think that they probably made it, and then disappeared and started new lives. So anything's possible. This is where Al Capone was in jail for a while. So it's a very famous prison. And back all the way in 1868, in a period of time where the United States was constantly making agreements and treaties with all these different Native American tribes, and then constantly breaking them, one of the 100 that they signed and didn't follow was there were two treaties of Fort Laramie, but the one in 1868, the Fort Laramie Treaty, said that federal land that was being taken, from the Native Americans would be returned to them once they were done with it. The purpose of this at the time was railroads. We were, 1868 is a time of huge expansion coming out of the Civil War, lots of growth. And we're trying to really increase the amount of railroads we have, especially in the West, so that we can continue to unify both sides of our country. And to create to build all these railroads as quickly as possible. A lot of times the federal government would take huge tracts of land and just give it to railroad companies and say, give us back what you don't end up using to construct the railroads. Sometimes they would give it back, sometimes they wouldn't. There really wasn't a lot of monitoring and following the law in a lot of these railroad companies until a lot of that land was stolen and never returned to the Native Americans. So in looking at this treaty, like I said, it says any federal land that's no longer being used is going to be returned to the Native people, because in reality, isn't all land, once Native American? And so any land that isn't being used by the federal government or owned by, private ownership, according to the treaty, is supposed to be returned to the Native American people. So this man you see here on the slide, his name was Richard Oakes, Oakes, as well as some of his other associates, who were all part of a group called Indians of All Tribes, which was a very large protest group in California. In 1969, they decided Alcatraz is the perfect place to sort of take back some of this power and set an example. Alcatraz since 1963 had been abandoned, so it was federal land no longer in use, which according to the treaty means it's now supposed to be returned to Native Americans. But it wasn't. It was just sitting there. It wasn't, now it's like a landmark and it's used as a tourist attraction. It was not in 1969. It was literally just sitting there. It had no power, no water, it was just, a building, an abandoned building. So Richard Oakes and the Indians of All Tribes decide to occupy Alcatraz. And so this begins on November 20th of 1969, and it actually lasted for 19 months. There were hundreds of Native Americans that moved in. They were able to get water and power hooked up for a while, but then in an effort to stop the occupation, the state and the federal government shut off their power and water, which definitely made things more difficult. Unfortunately, things started to fizzle out in the later months when Richard Oakes, actually his stepdaughter, I believe, she fell from a railing. It is an abandoned prison. It's not exactly like a safe zone. It's got several hazardous areas because of lack of upkeep, and she fell from a railing and was hurt, so she had to be taken to the hospital, which was obviously on the mainland, because all that's on the island of Alcatraz is Alcatraz, the prison. So they had to take her away, and Richard Oakes went with her and his family. And without that leadership, some people started leaving. They were really struggling with their lack of water and electricity after a while. So finally, after 19 months, the whole thing came to an end. But it really opened up the conversation, and this was really about consciousness raising. I'm sure that the Indians of All Tribes didn't expect for the federal government to be like, okay, cool, you can have Alcatraz. Had they, I'm sure they would have taken it and done something with it. But that wasn't really the goal. They don't want this abandoned prison. What they want is to have a conversation, a national conversation, start a dialogue about how all of these broken promises the federal government has made are affecting people to this day, and how those things need to be rectified. And if they're not going to be rectified, then this movement is going to rectify it themselves. And so that's what sort of begins all of this, is this occupation of Alcatraz. And occupations will end up becoming the main occupations, and marches will become the main protest strategy of the Red Power movement. They occupied several different places. They did more abandoned federal lands during this, but probably the most famous occupation was the occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which I just mentioned, the BIA, which was one of those groups that was supposed to be helping Native Americans, but constantly was mismanaging money and never doing what they were supposed to do. They did this occupation actually more than once. They did an occupation in 1971. They took over the offices in DC, but then in October of 1972, AIM and some other groups organized something called the Trail of Broken Treaties, which was a march meant to, highlight those broken promises of the federal government. This was in October of 1972, and the march ended at the BIA offices, where they stormed the offices, causing $1 million in damages, and then stayed in the offices for several days until their demands were met. They had like a 20-point plan to restore all these promises. And ultimately, it ended up sort of working. They ended up agreeing to some of these conditions, and they did ultimately disband the Bureau of Indian Affairs and replace it with an organization that has definitely worked better than the BIA did. So there were quite a few, occupations and marches and things like that came after this occupation of Alcatraz sort of kicked off these big protests. But for overall successes, there are really like 4 categories of things that we see happen here for the Red Power movement. The first is education. And we know that was a big long-term and short-term goal for the Red Power movement as a whole. In 1972, Nixon signed the Indian Education Act, which increased funds to school districts with high populations of Native children. Because a lot of those areas are so rural, they have such low tax revenue. So a lot of those schools are so underfunded, just like the Chicano schools in East LA, which those aren't necessarily underfunded because of lack of population. They're underfunded because their population is of a lower economic status. And similar situation here for a lot of these, tribes. A lot of Native American reservations have really high poverty rates. So they have such a lower tax, revenue in general. And so they need extra federal funds to give, to make, this educational experience not necessarily an equal one, but one that promises equity, which we know is different. But on top of the Indian Education Act, they also in 1978 will start building community colleges on Native American reservations to give people more access to higher education, which was huge. The next major category of change is going to be healthcare and medicine. I already mentioned Warren's, actions into stopping forced sterilization, and that definitely falls under this category. But also in 1976, the president will sign into law the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act, which granted scholarships for natives looking to study medicine, whether it be, that you want to go into be a doctor, whether you want to be a nurse, a pharmacist, a dentist. It provides scholarships for Native American students looking to do that. Also, they will end up doubling the budget of the Indian Health Service, which will provide a lot more health care to Native Americans, especially those on reservations where there's such a lack of health care, trying to right some of those wrongs from the Relocation Act in 1956. Next is religious freedom. A lot of states and some federal statutes had outlawed Indian religious practices, things like sweat lodges and stuff like that. And so in 1978, Jimmy Carter signed the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which terminated the outlaw of a lot of these religious practices so that they could regain their religious freedom. A lot of those laws were put in place back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when the federal government especially was trying to basically crush any remaining presence of Native culture and force all of these people into assimilation. And so they would outlaw certain things, like the ghost dance movement is around the same time. They outlawed a lot of things like that, which really is a part of their culture and ethnic pride. And so undoing a lot of those laws is definitely righting some wrongs. And then the same year, 1978, we're going to see the last of the 4 categories I said of change, which is going to be help for children. So in 1978, probably the biggest and one of the most famous laws to come out of this movement is the Indian Child Welfare Act. And so this was basically to fix a lot of the damage done back when the BIA and other groups were forcing Native American children out of their homes and off their reservations into boarding schools, where they were basically stripped of their cultural identity and punished if they identified or, related to any of it at all. So what this does is it allows tribes to have control over adoption and placement of Indian orphan children. So obviously, at this point, they had stopped forcing children away from their families and into boarding schools, but there were still plenty of Native American orphan children who were being adopted out or placed in the foster care system to non-Native families, and were losing so much of their heritage and connection to their culture. So the Indian Child Welfare Act kind of undoes a lot of that damage. Well, not undoes, but prevents more of that damage from taking place by ensuring that the tribe can sort of direct the placement of Native children to other Native families or communities so that they can continue to be connected to their heritage.